Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robby Valderrama. Before we jump into the show with DJ Chuang, we wanted to announce a giveaway. If you take a screenshot of your phone while listening to this episode, post it on your Instagram story and tag @PraiseHandsOfficial, you'll be entered to win a copy of DJ's book, MultiAsian.Church. You can choose to have the book mailed to yourself or to a friend. Just make sure you're following @PraiseHandsOfficial before the winner is announced on Wednesday, November 20th at noon Central Time. All right, now on to our show. Hello, Praise Hands. Today we are here with DJ Chuang. He is the author of the books MultiAsian.Church and Erasing Shame. And DJ, you're just doing so many interesting things in the multi-ethnic church world, talking about shame and mental health, even branching into generosity. You also do some really interesting things with technology. So I'm excited for our listeners to hear from you.
Well, thank you, Robby. It was great hanging out with you. And thank you for inviting me onto your podcast.
So for starters, you took a little bit of a different route than the so-called Asian American dream, going to seminary, becoming a pastor. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so before I segue into my own life, so the stereotype, which still is around, because I hear it in other people's story, is that the Asian American dream is for their children to become doctors, lawyers, or engineers, where they have a stable income and social status. That's the dream. And so when an Asian American young person aspires to be anything else, whether that's an artist or pastor, that takes a hit on the family, and they feel like, boy, they don't measure up, because social status is very important in Asian cultures. For me, I graduated with a computer engineering degree from Virginia Tech, and I worked a couple years as an engineer in Southern Maryland. But during those 2 years, I was discipled through a curriculum called Operation Timothy with Christian Businessmen's Committee, which is similar to Navigators. And my discipler prayed that God would show me my future and that it would be Dallas Theological Seminary, and I got confirmation through other means myself, and so we really took that as a sense of God's direction. And I went to Dallas Seminary from 91 to 95, not knowing what the future would hold. But I spent 10 years of my life trying to be a pastor, 5 years in seminary, 5 years pastoring, and came to realize that God wanted to use more than just my skill and duty and responsibility and obligation, but that God could also use my passions and interests and what excites me about God's kingdom. 20 years later, I'm doing what I'm doing now and feeling a lot more fulfilled and fruitful in what I'm doing.
Well, and I do have to say, when we were both in Dallas, I saw you acting very much like a pastor. I know you might not put that title on yourself, but convening people together, shepherding people, making connections, caring for people. And so it's really cool to see, even though you may not be in the official title in a local church setting, you're still able to play that function in the broader body
Thank you,
of
Robby.
Christ.
Thank you for noticing that.
I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, God did not waste those 10 years. Coming to realize that pastoring in a local church context was quite an adjustment for not just me, but also for my wife and other people. So I kind of pastor more broadly, as you've noticed. So thank you.
Right, absolutely. So tell us about your book, MultiAsian.Church. You're a well-respected leader in the Asian American church, and you've documented your observations as well as kind of the history of this movement. Would you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. Over the past 19 years since I left being a pastor, I've had the opportunity to have a little extra energy in addition to my day job to connect with pastors and churches around the country. And for me, I look at the Asian American church from a national perspective, whereas the typical pastor looks at it from a local and regional perspective. And so I wanted to see the common things that we all had from West Coast to East Coast that were unique to the Asian American church experience, and collected that and shared that through my blogging and some podcasting. And I actually had a 3-year role when I was a director of Asian American pastors at Leadership Network, and that afforded me a little more time and opportunity to talk with pastors and capture some of my observations. And one of the things I noticed was that Asian Americans were beginning to develop their own kind of church, And at that time, most, if not all the books were talking about the white church and the black church and how they were doing racial reconciliation, and that's still much needed. But I was beginning to see this almost an exponential curve of English-speaking Asian American churches that were reaching non-Asians as well. And because of our different history and our different interaction with other cultures and other ethnicities and races, I thought that was a unique flavor and contribution that should be highlighted. And so I put the book together with my observations, not only of the history of the ethnic Asian churches, but also how they were creating this new kind of church that was welcoming to Asians and non-Asians alike. And I think it brings one of the most unique contributions is that no longer do we have to deal with the tension of the black and white racist systems, but that we could come at it through a side door of hospitality and understanding that we're in the family of God together.
Yeah. And so as America moves to a majority-minority culture in the next couple of decades, Asian Americans seem to be positioned well. When you and I talked, you mentioned that most Asian Americans are by default bicultural. And so they have a set of cultural competencies that lends itself towards being able to touch multiple groups of people. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think one of the inherent advantages of being Asian American is that we are already bicultural. We had to navigate the Asian cultural family dynamics within our family of origin and perhaps within the ethnic Asian church. And then we also had to learn how to navigate the American culture in a broader, mostly white context where we had to learn the competencies of being bicultural. Culture isn't something that you can read a book about and learn. It's something you have to practice. And because we've lived it, especially for those born in America, in an Asian family, their whole life was navigating both cultures. I don't think that's true for most other ethnicities. Latinos experience some of that, but Latinos have a different context on the whole because there are so many Latinos.
Right. Yeah, so you mentioned kind of the dominant white culture. One of the questions we got from our listeners was if there are white church leaders that are looking to diversify their staff, how can they do that in a way that is empowering to people of color?
That's a great question. I think where the dominant, mostly white culture is at, there's such an inherent, almost unconscious way of how they do church and how they do leadership that empowering other cultural perspectives is very difficult without having to do the quote unquote deconstruction and reconstruction. So what does happen now is that majority culture churches that want to diversify, they do hire minorities, which is a good first step, but actually integrating their perspective and changing the leadership culture, that's just too hard. And I find very few that are able to do that.
Yeah. One of the difficulties I see in this conversation is there's this paradigm of respecting your authority, right? In a local church context, which is a very big paradigm in the Asian context, where you honor your elders, you honor your authorities. Now, when, say, a person of color comes into a predominantly white congregation, let's say the pastors are white, how does a person of color who wants to serve, who wants to honor the house, but also make sure that their perspective is represented, not just for themselves, but for people that are like them, what advice would you give a person in that situation for how to balance that tension?
If the setting is majority culture, because of the leadership and because of the structures and the systems and the processes, it's much easier for the minorities to learn to assimilate.
Sure.
Just as they've done with every other aspect of society. So that's going to be the default way that minorities will interact in a majority church context. There was a research paper that one of the fellow participants at the Mosaics conference shared with me that because majority culture institutions and organizations and systems are so ingrained into how we understand culture and theology and leadership that we don't know what it would look like to lead differently in a multicultural context or with a multicultural identity. So these African American and Asian Americans that are seeking to develop a new kind of church, they were described as estranged pioneers. that they're creating something so new that there's no precedence for it, and that ambiguity and that lack of value from their own home ethnicity is stressful. That's where we're at in the history of the development of a empowered, multicultural kind of a church.
Right. Yeah. So on that topic of multicultural ministry and worship, another question that we got from one of our listeners was, and I'll tie this together with something that you and I talked about last time. One of the things you mentioned is that it was largely American missionaries that brought the gospel to a lot of the countries that Asian Americans' families have originated from. So when you think of Black gospel or Latino worship, there's a very clear sound that comes to mind. When it comes to the Asian American worship setting, how can we be intentional to incorporate the Asian American sound, if you will, when it may not even be clear that there is one?
Boy, that's one of those ethnomusicology questions.
See, the word came up. It was a matter of time, right?
I know you won't use it, but I'll use it. There is some of the stereotypical Asian music that uses minor keys and things that don't fit into the typical musical scale. But what becomes popular in a global setting is things like K-pop and canto pop. Yeah. Asian American sound might be a little more the lament. So the predominant music style in majority culture is celebratory and the Victorian Christian life. But lament would be a part of sharing an Asian perspective on life, and perhaps a bit more of the looking back at history. That's kind of an Asian culture thing.
Intergenerational.
I'm not sure how that would be expressed in music, but those would be more of the tendencies from the East.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. So again, keying in on the Asian American perspective, your other book is called Erasing Shame. And there's an accompanying website, which I believe is at erasingshame.com, and there's a community that's built around that. How does shame affect Asian Americans leading in the church today?
Well, shame affects everything about being Asian American, because so much of our personality and understanding of our identity comes from the family of origin. And because Asian cultures are very much shame-based, shame gets weaponized as a means of parenting children to good behaviors. And then the community reinforces that shame for punishing bad behavior through isolation and marginalization. And so Erasing Shame came out of a podcast conversation that we started in February of 2018.
Okay.
And quoting Brene Brown, shame festers in silence. So the opposite of silence would be honest talk for healthy living. And so every week we would talk about different aspects of shame and how that affects us relationally and mentally and even physically and personally. Over the year and a half, we've learned just how big and how dark of an issue shame is because we've never talked about it. And so I'm not a professional psychiatrist or psychologist, and people that have studied it have, I think, only scratched the surface. It's so deep within who we are that when we begin to talk about the things that are hard to talk about with a few safe people, it begins to lighten our burden, and we begin to experience freedom and healing. And so in a church setting, churches often are not the safest place to be fully transparent and vulnerable, but where churches can provide that kind of a context in a small group or in a pastoral counseling or in Christian counseling, then people can begin to experience healing from erasing shame.
Yeah, that's really good. So you're also, and I'll tie together a few threads here. For your day job, you work in domain names, and I know you've got a website currently called mentalhealth.bible. Can you speak to how you're using that part of your life to address some issues that you see needing to be addressed?
Yeah, so being a follower of Christ, I certainly value the Bible, and I'm very grateful to have my day job with American Bible Society going on 6 years now. So during the day, I'm an internet engineer, and I take care of the digital plumbing for domain names that end in .bible. And one of the things that I get to do is a little bit of my creative side to find ways of highlighting the Bible in the midst of an internet that has all kinds of other stuff that's highlighted. So now we have a place for the Bible where the Word of God is proclaimed and engaged with the rest of life. And MentalHealth.Bible is one of the recent projects we launched, and we wanted to curate and collect and highlight the resources that are Bible related that would address mental health.
Yeah.
In my own journey, I have to manage my own mental health. So I have a diagnosis called bipolar disorder. So I've had to manage that for 19 years.
Okay.
That includes medication, self-care, seeing a talk therapist, and other parts of managing that to stay healthy. And from my experience, much of the mental health resources are not faith related. And yet faith is such an important part of so many people's human situation. And it's a powerful resource that we can incorporate into our self-care. And certainly I've experienced value from that. And we wanted to make that more accessible through a resource like MentalHealth.Bible.
Yeah, that's really good. So on this show, we talk about creative cross-cultural solutions. And a lot of times when certain issues come up that maybe are talked about more outside of church than they are inside church, the question is, man, what is the church doing about ... And I think it's really useful to have people like yourself that have personally dealt with an issue and are aggregating resources that can save people maybe a lot of time and a lot of pain, not only giving people connection with knowledge, but also with community to talk about these things. And so I would encourage our listeners, erasingshame.com as well as mentalhealth.bible. This is what the church is doing about this. In answer to that famous question, there are resources out there, I think, from Saddleback Church. I know there's more and more conversations that are happening about this topic.
Yeah, thank you for reiterating that. I know in my own struggle, it's very hard to find those resources. So now when I find them, I want to make it easy to discover and easy to share and continue to keep that up to date instead of having something that was written 10 years ago.
Right. So on the show, we cover the intersection of church, race, music, and economics. And speaking of that last item, economics, a big passion of yours is to see the church's dollars be deployed strategically for kingdom work. Can you describe your journey with generosity to our listeners?
Yeah, so last year I had a clarity about what I'm going to do for the rest of my life.
That's a good moment. Can you teach us all how to get to that?
It took me 52 years.
Okay, there we go.
So it was a lot of wandering and trying to be obedient to what God had for me at the time.
Yeah.
So walking long obedience, I think, is one of the phrases that a book has titled. And I don't have the gift or the curse of a long-term plan. So I just have short-term plans and what opportunity God brings my way.
Right.
And last year I had a sense of clarity that what God's taken me through life and how everything converged in terms of my skills and my passion can be captured in 3 letters, M, S, and G. MSG. Like
very Asian.
Like many Asian foods tend to have too much of.
Yes.
So M stands for Multiethnic. I've written a book on that. S is for shame. And then generosity. Particularly some Asian Americans that are highly educated and have a good amount of wealth. We don't really have a culture as Asians and Asian Americans of generosity and philanthropy. And part of my journey was working 10 years in a private family foundation where I got to see behind the curtains of philanthropy and how there are generous people with high net worth that have a large amount of fund that they're discerning and deciding and sifting through the world, trying to figure out where do they grant this money and their experience and efforts to make the world a better place. And while Asian churches, like other churches, have taught from the Bible that you need to be tithing and perhaps you need to be giving to missions, that's only a part of what we're called to do as followers of Christ. We can also make a big impact in shaping our communities in terms of its social welfare. We can be making a difference in the arts, education, medicine, and mental health. And so that's something I would like to cultivate relationships and conversations around so that we become more aware and understanding and strategic in how we can be good stewards of our wealth that many of us, particularly those of us that live in America, we have more than we need to live on. And if we're disciplined, we can probably make some adjustments and tighten our budget so that we can be more generous to give and support the needs of others who can use that help. I was recently trained through a program called Generous Giving, and one of the testimonies was of a guy named Tom, and he was a vice president of an internet company from 20 years ago named Earthlink. And when Earthlink went public, they generated millions and millions of dollars for their employees. And Tom and his wife had made a commitment before that happened that they would live within the means of a typical median income in Pomona, California. And so that was around $50,000 or $60,000. So when all this extra money came along, they didn't change their lifestyle or their budget. While his coworkers driving in with new Audis and Mercedes, he drove to work the next day with a Geo Metro. And so many of us can do more with that excess wealth for the good of others. And generosity is the new apologetics. I think that gets everyone's attention when people see that you live a simple life and that you can be generous for the good of others. Even more the answers that we give, generosity is just so countercultural.
Yeah.
Because what money means to us in a first world country.
That's so profound. Generosity is the new apologetics. I love that. So speaking of generous lives, probably one of the main Asian American church leaders that people will think of is Francis Chan. And he's made some bold moves in the last 10 years, leaving his megachurch in Southern California, moving up to Northern California, planting house churches. Recently, he just announced that him and his wife and family are moving to Hong Kong to be missionaries. What effect do you see the de-Americanization of Christianity across the globe having on the American church?
Boy, you're very thoughtful about these things that are happening in the American church.
I try.
The American church is just beginning to listen to the Spirit of God working through the global church. And so much of the American church has been influenced by the enterprise of capitalism that I think pretty much only the American church has this whole Christian industry of books and conferences and speakers who make their living doing the Christian thing. You don't hear that from Asia or South America. They're just doing church and they're worshiping God and they're reaching more people through church and not all this extra stuff. And so as Francis Chan moves to Hong Kong and develops more missionary strategies throughout Asia, perhaps that will inspire others to do likewise, because there's a couple billion, many billions more people who need to hear the gospel and the good news of Christ. And here in America, we just have more quote-unquote consumerism that doesn't do much for anybody else.
That is one of the things that we talk about in this show, is that in many ways the American church has filtered the gospel through the lens of American consumerism. So my question is this, following up with that: if we see a lot of these countries experiencing rapid growth in the church throughout Africa, throughout South America, throughout China, and these are some of the countries where we see the least amount of commercial entanglement, if you will, with the Christian faith, why is it that these countries continue to fly people to America to learn from us? And even if you look at the music, for example, the Christian music industry is based here in Nashville, where I live, and has so much influence around the globe. And obviously there's a lot of good that comes from that, but there's also a dark side to it where the expressions of local sounds can be devalued by the local communities because they're comparing themselves to something that's not even their cultural context. So how do we have a global church that learns from each other but doesn't become overly commercialized?
That's a hard question, because that's the business side of ministry. So it does take funds to accomplish some things. And well, let's tie it to generosity. So if someone who's got the funds and can be generous to facilitate the roundtables and the conversations that would bring global leaders together to learn from each other for the good of the whole church, then we can begin to see that happen more. Lausanne is one of the organizations that does that on certain occasions. But we need more of those kind of things rather than conferences where you have the teacher talking to the students. And I'm guessing that because America has those conferences, those seem to be the only place you can learn. And then seminary in the global context might be too expensive. And so leaders around the world do know that they need to be learning to stay sharp as leaders. And so the obvious opportunities are the American conferences because that's kind of what shows up.
Right.
And the way we can change that is generosity because commercialism has a life of its own. And it's as if profit is never enough. And that's endemic to the commercial enterprise. I was talking with a friend who is in that entrepreneurial world. It's like, well, how big is enough and how much is enough? And he says, it's never enough. And he was a pastor. So there's something not quite right about the machine of capitalism.
Right. So if you're having a heart for generosity like you do, or say for our listeners, if they've got money that they're sitting on and they want to be able to steward it for the greatest kingdom impact, if you were to say, here are one or two strategic shifts that I would like to see the global church make in terms of how the dollars are stewarded, what would those recommendations be?
The first strategic move is being able to talk about money. Right now, it is still a very difficult topic to talk about in any kind of church, American or non-American, ethnic minority or not, that we just don't know how to talk about money in a safe manner. Because when the pastor talks about it, he's vested in how he talks about it because his livelihood depends on it. And then outside of that, when ministries or conferences and authors and speakers talk about it, they have a vested interest because their money's tied into it. But it is possible, and Generous Giving is one of those organizations that has taken money out of the equation in their resources.
Because they set boundaries for what's able to be talked about at their conferences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they have drawn a clear line that they will not fundraise, that they will not tell you where to give and how much to give. And their programs are entirely funded by 3 foundations. So that you can talk about money and there's absolutely no strings attached. And there's no hidden agenda other than that they want to give something to you in the gift of generosity so you can experience more of God's joy. And so that would be the most strategic things I can think of. That once we are able to talk about money, then money no longer has power over us. And then generosity also takes the power of greed out. So money is such a powerful thing. I mean, that's why Jesus talked about it more than heaven and hell is what some people say.
Yeah. Speaking of Francis Chan, I have some friends that are part of his network. In their house church, they've got a model where, from what I understand, they meet corporately as the whole network, you know, in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe once a month or so, something like that. And then every week, each of their local gatherings meets weekly. And all the tithes and offerings are collected at the local level. And they just decide, all right, based on our neighborhood, who do we want to give to? And what causes do we care about? There's no church staff, and so there's no overhead. There's no building. There's no overhead. And it's interesting that they don't seem to have a problem talking about money in that context. Obviously, Francis Chan would definitely lean towards that being the solution to this problem. I wonder if there's also certain parameters that larger churches can instill that can enable that same level of transparency with conversations. Like even if, and I know a lot of people would be very against this, but significantly increased transparency within the local church in terms of how the dollars are spent. Because if you look at how the early church functioned, yes, the apostles were the ones that routed the money from different cities, but within the local context, you didn't get the sense that there was this big us and them between clergy and laity, and that the clergy knew where the dollars were being spent and that the laity didn't. And I wonder if increased transparency would help there to be less of a man behind the curtain feeling. Because the reality is, yeah, sure, there's probably some fraud going on in Christian churches with the lack of Form 990 and things like that. But most churches are well-intentioned and are trying to do the best they can with the money that they have. And there's got to be a solution to work towards. And so maybe that's a future guest I need to have on, someone who's figured that out.
Yeah, there's a guy named Mark DeMaz that talked about the new church economics. So,
yep, he was just on our show a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So he's already talked about it, that churches need multiple income streams.
Right.
not just the donation plate. The thing about transparency is that's a good secondary step. But it's the decisions on how money is being raised and spent before the transparency that's even more important.
How those decisions are made.
Yeah, how those decisions are made, and even some philosophical shifts. So if a church were to make a decision like all your staff is equally paid, that would be a strong philosophical statement that we're in this together and no one job is more valuable than another.
That's a really radical idea.
I couldn't see that because human nature wanting more compensation for so-and-so and other reasons that people have more compensation, that's too radical. But that would make a profound statement that, hey, we're all living within our means. We're provided for, and then we're doing the work of ministry.
Yeah.
There's a church that we used to be a part of called Rock Harbor here in Costa Mesa, California. And they would give 10% of their offerings to outside ministries and missions. So that was baked into how they spent their money.
Right.
So that wasn't an extra faith-based offering. That wasn't something else they raised separately. But any money they collected, they already have tithed off of that.
Yeah.
That's a good statement.
Yeah.
So there are things that you can do at the beginning, in addition to transparency, that can really make a statement of, hey, we're being good stewards, and here's how we as an organization are being generous.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground today, talking about the multi-ethnic church, the Asian American intersection with that, shame and mental health, technology, generosity. I really appreciate your leadership on all these, DJ. I think your story is fascinating to me because of how you've really had to battle through a lot of these things personally. And for every person like you that is being vulnerable with their story and aggregating these stories and aggregating these resources, there's probably 1,000 others that are not doing that and could be. And I hope that what you're doing is an encouragement to everybody listening to this, regardless of what they've gone through, regardless of their background, or even if they don't consider themselves, the stereotypical whatever, they can still be a leader right where they're at. So thank you for your inspiration and thank you for doing what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Robby, for connecting with me again. And I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you for what you're doing at Praise Hands as well.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
I think it's an act of generosity right there.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. This is crazy. We've got just a few more weeks left in the season 2 of the Praise Hands podcast. We've covered everything from economic justice to virtual reality church to multicultural worship, and it's been a blast. Few next steps for you, Praise Hands. First, I am currently accepting a limited amount of speaking engagements for 2020. If your church, school, or organization is looking for a speaker to provide education, inspiration, and reconciliation, you know who to call. If you visit the contact page at praisehands.com, our team will arrange a 30-minute video call with me to connect. I'd love to join you. Second, if you believe in this vision of creative cross-cultural Christianity, we would love to have you on our monthly support team. All monthly supporters receive access to exclusive bonus content you won't find anywhere else, as well as a recurring video call with me, which I happen to think is pretty awesome. Lastly, the biggest way this podcast has grown is by word of mouth. If you can think of a friend who'd like this episode, be a pal, use that share button. Well, Praise Hands, I'm your host, Robby Valderrama. Can't wait to be with you again next week.